Welcome to Austen Mondays. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we're going on a biblio-venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, like today, a creator or Janeite about Austen and her works, and then I have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And our special guest today, all the way from Melbourne, Australia, is Clara Tuite. Welcome, Clara.
Thank you, Ed. Great to be here. Great to be part of this rolling Austen fest.
It is, yeah, and to have people join from all over the world is one of the joys of doing this program that we've had. So. More with Clara in a moment. Stay tuned for our chapter annotation segment when Dr. Lauren Nixon will join me to talk about chapters 46 and 47, or volume 3, chapters 4 and 5, News of Lydia. And if you are watching live on YouTube or watching the recording right now, I invite you to please like the video and also subscribe to the channel. Doing that gives our show greater visibility and leads to more people discovering Austen Mondays. And today, stay tuned for an announcement after the Turnabout the Room segment when I'll announce a new show that will begin when Austen Mondays ends. Now, before everybody's like, oh, it's the next show. It's not going to be the next weekly show. That won't start until September, but there'll be a different monthly show that will start in March, and I'll tell you about that at our break. But for now, let's take a turn about the room. Clara Tuite is a professor of English at the University of Melbourne, where she teaches and researches literary romanticism and the history of the novel. Her work focuses on 18th and 19th century literature and its social and cultural contexts, ongoing reception, and afterlives. She is the author of Romantic Austen, Sexual Politics and the Literary Canon. And with Claudia Johnson, she edited The Blackwell Companion to Jane Austen. And with Claudia Johnson, she wrote the 30 Great Myths about Jane Austen, a book that I really love. Clara, I am very happy to have you on the show today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, Ed.
And we always start this segment. I ask our guests if you have an Austen discovery moment.
Austen discovery moment. Yeah, I guess like many people, I first discovered Austen at high school, and I loved the comedy and the satire and the kind of stylistic panache, and the irony. I was also a teenage feminist, so I really loved the kind of focus on women's experience. And I guess that the way that Austen modelled this wonderful feminine wit that was just so empowered and dynamic, and elusive, I guess. And then I guess I rediscovered Austen at university. So it was a sort of, a moment of rediscovery, rereading. And I guess I really, was really interested in thinking about the significance of Austen as a kind of canonical figure. What accounted for that enduring appeal? Why is it that you come to Austen through these pre-readings, for better and worse? It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of wonderful to be joining an ongoing conversation about Austen. And so, drilling down into those ironies and complexities, I guess, and thinking about I guess like wonderful, things like thinking about the complexities of Austen's interrogation of the marriage market. It's so satirical and so critical, but at the same time, there's this kind of wonderful lightness about it, and this inevitability of the kind of romance plot at the same time, which, so it's that kind of contradiction that I think is so fascinating.
Is Austen one of the authors the reason why this became your time period? Was it?
Absolutely. That's right. I mean, I guess, and I suppose that was another thing that I did in that first book. I was, I think of myself as a romanticist, but it was Austen who took me in there, even though when I started the thesis that became the book, Austen wasn't really considered a kind of romantic.
Yeah.
She was more considered a kind of neoclassical daughter of Samuel Johnson. So I was interested in thinking about her in relation to romanticism. Even though what's so appealing is that double kind of Augustinism and the romanticism.
That kind of 18th, that neoclassicism, that Johnson. I mean, I see the Johnson in lots of times. I think there's a passage in chapters we're covering today where it seems like it's Samuel Johnson writing, but it's that late, especially Persuasion. I always find to be a novel that seems to be more rooted in the romanticism than it does in the 18th century.
I think you're absolutely right, Ed. And with Pride and Prejudice, I mean, something like that wonderful opening sentence. I mean, so poised and so Augustan, and the irony is very kind of Augustan and as well. But then, yes, I mean, in Persuasion. And I guess the way in which the narrator just so inhabits that point of view of the character, and that kind of feeling for the everyday, and the feeling for pathos and emotion, I think is so romantic as well. Yeah, and very much so in Persuasion. One
of the things running through Pride and Prejudice, but we've touched on this several times and talking about it, is the idea of class and the class system in these novels and Austen's life. And so let's talk a little bit about that, how Austen's approach to class informs the way she puts these characters together, how she interrogates that as thinking like.
No, I think that's a really good way of coming at it, Ed, that sense of the significance of class as a way of putting characters together. Because I think often you hear the term class and it sounds as though it's about something very kind of static and fixed. But in fact, class, it's a way of coming at a certain mobility of the social world in Austen's world, that Austen is so interested in both describing and navigating, and also ironizing, but also there's a sense in which she's showing characters make themselves and the way that characters become unmade, and all of those complicated kind of alliances and social gestures of moving up or moving down, people putting themselves forward. I mean, Bingley, for example, who's described as gentlemanlike and then immediately compared with Mr. Hurst, who's just acting like a gentleman, but not really a gentleman. And then Darcy coming along and being the gentleman. And there's a way in which, and then of course immediately drawing all of this kind of disapproval because he's so kind of haughty and arrogant. But what's interesting there is the way in which Austen is so fascinated by characters reading other characters and putting the characters together, as you said, by showing the way in which they read other characters. I mean, Elizabeth referring to Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst as fine ladies, but then going on to kind of, the narrator then goes on to talk about the way in which they're very preoccupied with the history of, Bingley's connections and respectability, but there's this sort of stigma of trade. And so, Austen's so fascinated in tracking those movements forward, but also the ways in which characters are sort of haunted by the taint of trade, for example, that is then, and trade is then kind of vindicated in various ways in the novel.
It seems if you have enough, if you make a great deal of money in trade, like Bingley's family did, then you get to be able to transcend class. And this is something that had been happening, in British society for a couple hundred years by this point of people becoming rich through trade and then elevating themselves. And within Austen's novel, is maybe some characters think that all the lines are solid, but Austen as an author and some of her characters realize that no, it's not. It's far more.
Absolutely. I think that's a great point, Ed. There's a way in which, I mean, I guess someone like Lady Catherine, for example, I mean, she's this caricature of someone who's trying to keep all the lines in place. And, the way that she lectures Elizabeth.
Pollute the family, she said.
Polluted, yeah, that's right. And she asks her what her connections are. And Elizabeth says, whatever my connections are, if they're not, if they're not a major obstacle for Darcy, I don't see what they have to do with you. And so connections there, I think, is such an important word, and it's used over and over and over in the novel. And it is a way in which, again, it's about how class is about interrelations, and it's not about fixed position. And I guess, I mean, thinking about Austen herself and class more broadly, I mean, Austen's family was a gentry family that very much depended on connections and acts of patronage from people more wealthy and more socially elevated, who could act for them. And I think that sense of connections is really important, because it's and Austen is really interested in showing how people use and utilize those connections, and how people
you mentioned
people can do for one another.
You mentioned Austen's family and her father being a clergyman, a very respectable position in society, but one of those in between places if you're trying to figure out who's above who and how people relate.
That's right. Yes, I mean, George Austen, a country clergyman. He was given the living by a more wealthy relative. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of social and cultural capital, I guess. And that was important in terms of the kind of education at home that the children had and that Jane had before she was educated at the school in Reading. But yes, gentry, I mean, I guess the Austen family were kind of on the lower sort of fringes of the gentry, and they were dependent on those connections. I mean, her brother Edward Knight was adopted by the Knight family and then inherited through them the property that where Austen lived later in life. And so that kind of sense, and the way in which George Austen, it was a kind of precarious life, I think, and particularly for Austen once the father died in Bath, and she was moving around and was living with other relatives, the more wealthy relatives, the Lee family, who were the family on her mother's side. So a very kind of precarious existence Austen had for many years. And I think it's that sort of being on the margins that gives her that kind of edge, I think, and that, that ability to kind of look at things from the outside and have a more kind of critical eye.
I often feel like she doesn't, she's Austen in the world she created, they don't seem to want to, her characters don't seem to want to have a revolution. Like, they don't want to overturn the system.
No.
But she definitely wants to challenge it and
absolutely.
I guess maintain that mobility that can go on between people. Or is it a matter of recognizing that behavior is more important to respectability I don't know. I mean, there's
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think, yeah, I mean, my position, yeah, it kind of changes, I guess, and which is a good thing, I think, because as you read the work more, yeah, you're kind of aware to the complexities and the subtleties, I think. And I mean, I guess
Elizabeth is okay with Darcy being proud if like for the right reasons, and then but it
that's right.
is when
That's
he's
right.
mean about it or that then cruel about it, then that's where she draws the line, and then she learns that he wasn't cruel, and there you go.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's that lovely moment at the end of the novel where she says that she congratulates him for being proud of her. There's that kind of moment. Yeah, and the coldness. I think the pride. It's so interesting, and I think this is another thing that comes back to your point about those characters that hold the line. I mean, there's a wonderful, I guess one of the things that keeps that dynamism and complexity in view and keeps you questioning. I mean, yes, of course there's a way in which Jane Austen is not Mary Wollstonecraft, and there's not that kind of radicalism. And there is a sense, what Marilyn Butler used to call Tory feminism. There's a way in which, there is this kind of investment in that existing kind of world, but also a sense of wanting to kind of enliven it and challenge it. And I think that, one of the really interesting ways in which Austen does that is to have that kind of counterpoint between those really traditional conservative characters like Lady Catherine, who is so holding the line, so full of hauteur and obnoxiousness, and the contrast with Darcy, who, when we first see him in that moment in the Meryton Ball, such cruel words, but also the way that he looks at Elizabeth. I mean, he looks at her and engages her eye, and then looks away as he knows she's hearing those words, which is extraordinary, really. So he anticipates that kind of coldness that you see in his connection, Lady Catherine, in the same way, I think, that Elizabeth, when that moment happens, we see her telling her friends about it as an example of the ridiculous. And it's a moment at which Austen displays Elizabeth's lively disposition. And then her mother, that anticipates her mother coming in later and telling the husband about Darcy and how high and mighty he is. He walks here, he walks there. So there's that wonderful sense of that spirit of kind of mimicry and mockery that Lizzie and the mother both have. And that, Austen is fascinated by that sort of energy that really challenges the system, I think. And another really interesting thing about Mrs. Bennet, I think, is the way in which, if we're talking about challenging the existing status quo, the key critic of the system of the entail and male primogeniture is Mrs. Bennet. Yeah. And also Lady Catherine later. But they're the characters that are maligned and caricatured. So what is that about? That's quite a fascinating thing too. Why does Austen do that?
Yeah, Mrs. Bennet doesn't understand what an entail is or how it operates, but she certainly understands the effects. She certainly understands the consequences.
Absolutely, yeah.
So does Lady Catherine, who, but as a woman without a husband and only one daughter, she's all in favor of, not in favor of an entailment away from the female.
That's right, yeah. And it's so interesting in that moment when, that Austen stages this as a moment when her daughters try to educate her about what an entail is, but she was beyond reason. So Austen invokes that Enlightenment feminist category, reason, in order to in order to keep this kind of mockery going of Bennet. But there's more I think more similarity between Elizabeth and Mrs. Bennet than seems to be on the surface, I think.
Sorry if any of our audience has forgotten. During the Turnabout the Room, spoilers abound. So it's only when we talk about the chapters that there are no spoilers.
Did I just do a spoiler?
No. We're allowed to talk about what's happened in the novel since then during this segment, because it's important to get through these different topics to be able to talk about everything that happens. Mr. Collins is very interesting too, because he's also a supporter of the strict lines being drawn, and Austen doesn't give him very much of a backstory, but it's interesting what we do get and how his father educated him, and the treatment that he had at his father that kind of made him very kind of mean, small-minded.
Absolutely. No, it's interesting, isn't it? And
because
so interesting.
Effectively the same class as the Bennet family.
Absolutely, that's right. Yet so invested. I mean, there's a way in which his whole persona and sense of identity is produced by his sense of this really abject kind of dependence on Lady Catherine de Bourgh's patronage, and he can't do anything else except produce himself through that. And it's so interesting the way that, I mean, Mrs. Bennet calls him that odious man, and then Mr. Bennet says, Mr. Bennet reads the letter.
He's not odious until he's not with the Marion. Then he becomes odious. Yeah, that's
right. He becomes really odious, and then also the letter. Not to do a spoiler, but the letter about Lydia, which is just really horrifying. And it's sort of at that moment that he lurches from being just a kind of a pompous fool into someone who's quite cruel. And I think, as you were saying, Ed, there's a kind of meanness there and something really quite dark, I think. And it's so wonderful the way in which Austen just mobilizes those different emotional kind of tonalities. I think, first he's just grotesque and funny and hilarious, but then really punishing in that letter about Lydia.
It's not always something that modern audiences can get their head around because of the intricacies of the way these class divisions work in their time, and I think especially in the moment where Mr. Collins is going to introduce himself to Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth is horrified, and so is Darcy, that this would happen, because in spite of the fact that Mr. Collins is a respectable clergyman and of the gentry class through his own family, that's not something that is. It's the behavior, right? It's the ungentlemanly behavior of doing that.
That's right. And I guess the sort of the contradiction on the one hand between this there's a way in which that obsequiousness, it's so self-promoting, and it's completely without any sense of recognition of social form, and also general basic kind of social respect and generosity, I guess. And so I think, that's a really key moment that again works to illuminate Darcy's character. I mean, that sense in which he's often very kind of silent, and even when Elizabeth tells him about Lydia, I mean, his air was gloomy, so he's still that kind of enigmatic, brooding kind of figure, but that silence and the quietness, it becomes something more and more benign, I think, whereas with Mr. Collins, that performance of meekness that is just very, very self-promoting, and
Uriah Heep like he is, so in that sense. Yeah.
It's very, very much so.
This
Yeah.
this whole issue of class difference and class conflict, I mean, this is every Austen novel too, right? I mean,
It
the
is. It is, isn't it?
sensibility, the Dashwoods and the Farrar family and this novel, and then the Bertrams and Mansfield Park and Harriet Smith and John Martin, and like every
Absolutely.
novel it seems to, and obviously Persuasion with Sir Walter Elliot and
Yeah, yeah. Yes. And I mean, you mentioned Emma and Martin. And that's a really interesting, Harriet Smith and Robert Martin, a really interesting novel. I think, again, I mean, Emma's such a fascinating character there because she's so empowered.
yeah.
And she too, in a way, a bit like Lady Catherine, but of course she's a far more fascinating character, but she too is kind of quite invested in keeping the kind of boundaries in place and matchmaking, and that, the way in which she, I guess, like Darcy, tries to separate Harriet from the man that she loves, and that's really kind of interesting, I think. I mean, she's the most wealthy, the most kind of empowered Austen heroine, and the most, in some senses, the most capricious, but also wanting to kind of keep the kind of social boundaries in place. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have lots more to talk about with this novel as we go through it to finish it up over the next month and a half. I want to thank you for being here. What do you have coming up? Or what are you working on now?
What do I have coming up? Well, a few things. I have an essay coming out in a volume on Austen and precariousness, called Precarious Austen, and it's an essay I wrote many years ago, when it was the bicentenary, but it's only coming out this year, but I hope, and that's in a volume from that conference, and that's a piece that looks at those class issues in other novels, and particularly the Watsons, which is that very kind of,
well, it's an early fragment in Austen's career.
That's right. Yeah, a kind of mid-career fragment that she went back to. That's right. And something, and again, a novel with a lot of pathos that I think really speaks closely to Austen's situation.
Did an Austen family member finish that, or was that Sanditon, that somebody in the
that was Sanditon. The continuation of Sanditon. I mean, again, I've worked quite a bit on Sanditon. I love the incomplete novels. I think there's such a wonderful contrast to the wonderful finishedness and the kind of just the complete gems that the complete novels are. But I really love the incomplete ones. So that's coming up. I'm also working on a book on romanticism and romantic love, and so I'm looking at Austen novels, and as part of that, and one of the things I'm interested in there is the genres of the novel and romantic poetry, and how they kind of remediate forms like the love letter, so those sort of epistolary modes, which we see a lot of in Pride and Prejudice. And the love letter of Robert Martin that's twisted in Harriet's hand. That's something I'm kind of quite interested in that chapter as well.
Excellent.
Well,
I look forward to that. And Clara, thank you so much for taking a turn about the room with us today. This was a real pleasure.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much. It was wonderful to be here and take the turn around the room with you, Ed. Thanks very much. And have fun reading the novel, the next part of the novel. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Everyone, next week, our turnabout the room guest will be another Janeite from Australia, Susanna Fullerton, president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia, will join us. And coming soon for the rest of February, our Turnabout the Room guests are on February 20th. We have Bridget Draxler and Danielle Spratt, authors of Engaging the Age of Jane Austen. And on February 27th, we have the hosts of the Reclaiming Jane podcast, Lauren Weathers and Emily Davis Hale. Well, let me take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide. If you would like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You can also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn more about how to become a member on our website. And at the end of every show, I give a shout out to all who have donated or become members since our last show. And I have a couple new members to announce at the end of this show. There are lots of great in-person and virtual programs and courses at the Rosenbach. Our winter program and course schedule is up, soon to be followed in another month by the spring programs and courses. And I wanted to share this one right now with you. This is a winter course that begins, it's an in-person course. So this is for if you're in the Rosenbach area, in the Philadelphia area, you want to take a course at the Rosenbach. It's a course on Robert Burns and poetry, While We Still Read and Sing Robert Burns, with brilliant Burns professor Steve Newman from Temple University. The special part about taking a course like this at the Rosenbach is we have one of the world's greatest Robert Burns collections. So while you take the course, while you talk about the poems with this great professor, we bring out the manuscript copies of those poems and letters and first editions of Robert Burns for you to see during the course as well. So this is a very special course and I highly recommend it. It begins on February 23rd and it is in person, and I highly recommend you taking it. What else do we have to talk about today? You can also join us on our Facebook group page, Austen Mondays, for lots more info, news, links, conversation, and fun. And for today's chapter annotation segment, I want to welcome back my co-host, Dr. Lauren Nixon of the Ghoul Guides. Hey, Lauren.
Hello. Hi, Ed. How are you? I'm good, thank you. How is everybody?
I'm just plugging this Robert Burns course that starts an in-person course. That happens. But in the spring courses, which haven't been released yet, so you all get a little preview now.
Sneak peek.
Sneak peek. There will be a course in the spring taught by the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Dr. Mary Going, called Gothic Transformations, right? Tell us about that, Lauren.
Yeah, we're back. So this will be, so we did a Gothic Origins course for the Rosenbach last year, which I think some of you watching came along to, which was really great. We really enjoyed it. So we'd already been hatching a plan of how we could convince Ed to ask us back for another course, and then you emailed us asking us to come back.
And doing a course on some of my favorite books.
Yeah, so we thought, because we kind of establish where the Gothic started last time, and I know for a couple of people that had joined us for Frankenstein and for Dracula, it was something that was very new. So this time we are digging into the real weird and wonderful period of the Gothic. So we're going to kick off with some of Mary Shelley's short stories, which are really exciting. I actually have a copy of Transformation sitting next to me that I was looking at earlier when we were planning our ideas. And we're also going to look at some of the big 19th century texts. So we're going to hit Jekyll and Hyde, and one of my personal favorites, The Island of Dr. Moreau. And we're going to think about how the Gothic in the 19th century becomes obsessed with transformation and transmutation and transfiguration, and how there's new literal mutation in some cases in these texts comes into the Gothic in this really exciting build-up, mostly after Frankenstein, which why we thought we'd kick off with Shelley, starts to evolve as science becomes more and more a part of, you know, the social consciousness. I'm really excited. I don't get to
I am
do
too.
a lot of 19th century, so I'm like, yes.
You know, that's my period, and those books I love. I used to teach when I taught monster classes at college. I frequently taught those. I absolutely love that you're doing that. That's just a sneak peek, everybody. You won't find that information on the website yet. You won't find anything about this for another month when we post all the spring courses and programs coming up. But just for my audience here, that's a little preview for you. But I am announcing not the next weekly show that's going to happen in the fall to you know, go on with after Austen Mondays, but I'm starting a new monthly show that will begin as soon as Austen Mondays ends. And then I will continue this show once a month, even when the next weekly show begins in the spring. And this show is going to be Pickwick Monthly. And it is a show about Charles Dickens's Pickwick Papers. You know, he's behind me all the time over my right shoulder. It will be a monthly journey through the Pickwick Papers, the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club, as you see on the serial cover that we've altered here to add our information. It was first serialized by Dickens and published in 20 monthly parts, 2 to 3 chapters per month from March 1836 to October 1837. And I am going to be taking a monthly look at this, again, with a rotating set of Dickensian co-hosts, and we'll talk each month about the serialized part that came out. So you will get to relive Dickens' funniest novel, just as his first readers did, a couple chapters at a time. This program will be free for anyone to watch. We'll do it live. This one will go on Saturday afternoons, 2 o'clock in the Eastern time. That'll make it easier for European or British people to watch, because it'll only be 7 o'clock in the evening then. And it'll go for 20 months. We start out, you know, March and next month, and we'll go to October 2024. So you can register for this at the, I know I commit myself for long periods for shows. You can go to the Rosenbach's website, which I will share with you, and register there. All these wonderful programs and courses that we have. Where's Pickwick Monthly with Mr. Pickwick there? Oh my gosh, there's so many things even before that. Here he is, Pickwick Monthly. Register here. And if you register, what you get is an email from me every month with links, all kinds of, you know, Dickensian fun stuff in it. And then again, it'll be streamed live on our YouTube channel for you to watch. The Rosenbach, if you guys don't know, in our collections, we have not only the complete serial issues of the Pickwick Papers, we also have a portion of the Pickwick manuscript, which is really interesting to have, about 10 or 12 pages or so of the manuscript, which is divided up all over the world. We also have the earliest surviving literary manuscript of Charles Dickens in our collection. We have lots of letters. We have the last photograph taken of Charles Dickens, and also signed by him the day before he died, because he signed it and dated it the day before he died. And we have a lock of Dickens's hair. So there's lots of great Dickens things at the Rosenbach, and it's a collection that I like to play in a lot. So I'm finally getting to do, there he is behind me, how many shows now, and I'm finally going to do a show. Again, though, this isn't the next weekly program. That will announce next month, and the penultimate show will announce the next weekly program that will begin in the fall. So this is for me to continue talking about books that I love, but in this, you know, and it's a funny novel and fun. It's actually my favorite Dickens novel. I recognize that there are great, better novels that Dickens has written after this, but this is the one I enjoy the most. This is the world that I want to be in. So it'll be a lot of fun to do this. All righty. So that's our announcement for tonight. Please register for it. I'd love to see some of you join me to learn about the Pickwick Papers over the course of the next 20 months. That'll be fun. That's like, it's so long,
Just a short undertaking.
Yeah. Well, right now, what am I drinking? I am drinking a cocktail called the Brighton Tryst. I almost said twist, but it's a take on it. It's the Brighton Tryst for Lydia and Wickham. It is
Excellent.
brandy, Grand Marnier, and a little absinthe. That's the dangerous streak in there that's going on. And I wrote to everybody, beware Lydia. Oh, too late. She just drank all of it and asked for another. Lydia doesn't,
Yeah, she definitely mind sweeps in clubs. I would not trust her.
She is not concerned with the danger at all, is she? All right,
No.
Let's move on and talk about this book. There we go. And today we are doing chapters 46, 47, News of Lydia. And if you are reading a version that divides it into volume chapter numbers, it's volume 3, chapters 4 and 5. So when last we met, and you weren't here, Lauren, things were looking up for Elizabeth and Darcy. He was really thinking, wow, I still have a chance. I could, maybe he will, maybe he is still interested in me, and I've been crazy to not be interested in him. And then the letters arrive.
Yes, this is the classic. I mean, I wonder if Austen is the kind of progenitor of this or not, but this is the classic, rom-com setup now. We're 3/4 of the way through. Things are starting to look good. The relationship is starting to form, and then something bad is going to happen. And how will it all be resolved?
And this chapter begins. She has letters. 2 letters at once came, one which was marked that it had been missent elsewhere. And so she opens the letter, and she could tell that it was written in evident agitation. And why don't you read the beginning of this letter down to the truth with Go ahead.
Okay. Since writing the above, dearest Lizzie, something has occurred of a most unexpected and serious nature. But I am afraid of alarming you. Be assured that we are all well. What I have to say relates to poor Lydia. An express came at 12 last night, just as we had all gone to bed, from Colonel Forster, to inform us that she was gone off to Scotland with one of his officers, to own the truth with Wickham. Imagine our surprise. Do you want me to carry on?
Go on a little more. Yeah.
To Kitty, however, it does not seem so wholly unexpected. I am very, very sorry. So imprudent a match on both sides. But I am willing to hope the best, and that his character has been misunderstood.
Yeah, let's stop it there. I mean, Lydia's run off with Wickham to Scotland to get married. And we also learned that Kitty is not surprised. And this, Jane recognizes that this is an imprudent match, but she still hopes for the best. Maybe we're wrong about Wickham.
Sweet Jane Bennet.
I tell you, she gives everybody the benefit of the doubt, which is what it's a good thing to do. Isn't it?
I don't know. My family motto is hope for the best, expect the worst. So I don't think it could ever have been me. Yeah, it is an interesting one, because I still go back and forth on this revelation, because it doesn't make any sense. And I still, every time I reread the novel, I think, why does this happen? Because it makes sense in terms of Wickham has been established as the villain. Wickham has been established as, not to be trusted, as, a wolf in malicious clothing. So it makes sense that he would, endanger and defile one of Lizzie's sisters, and therefore the Bennet family, and therefore this potential union. But like Jane says, it doesn't make any sense because she's got no money. She's not got any connections.
The second letter
yes,
and says, oh no, bad news.
Improved not gone to Scotland.
Mr. Wickham and our Lydia would be. We are now anxious to be assured it has taken place, for there is but too much reason to fear they are gone. They are not gone to Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that he never intended, as Jane says, he never intended to marry at all. I always think this. I think when I first read it as a teenager, I was like, oh yeah, of course he would run off with an attractive young girl to London just to, have some fun. But at that time, I was not much younger than Lydia. So she at 15, 16 seemed to me like an adult. And it didn't occur to me until much later rereading the novel that this is the second time that Mr. Wickham has attempted to run off with a child. And I have this really kind of like, is it because, is there something more sinister than the sinister things that we already know about him? Because it's such a strange decision to put himself and his reputation is obviously already in danger, but the Bennets aren't so inconsequential that this is not going to catch up with him.
Mm-hmm.
They can't pay him off. It's such a strange decision for him. So, it doesn't make sense in terms of his otherwise scheming master plans.
Just as Darcy recognizes the way the Bennet family presents themselves to society, and Darcy thinks they are not of consequence because of the way the mother acts, because of the way the younger sisters act, because of the way the father acts.
Mm-hmm.
Does Wickham perhaps think the same, that I have got nothing to worry about this, guys? What's Mr. Bennet going to come after me?
Essentially, and I think this is what I go back and forth on. Is this a case of he is so arrogant that he also dismisses them because the part of the point is he's also proud? Or is that, I don't necessarily have anything to say in terms of like, this is what I think is happening. I just think it's so interesting that a novel 2 centuries old still has us going back and forth about why this happens. And I think what's really interesting is the adaptations all frame it slightly differently. And obviously we don't see what's happening in Brighton. So some adaptations and continuations see it as him losing his head a little bit. Some, frame it as he's somehow trying to get some kind of revenge. It just doesn't make sense. And I think the older I get, the more I think, again, how is this fully grown man once again, taking advantage and trying to seduce a teenage girl?
Well, and it's just that he does that is what we can read about his character, that he is willing to go and trick this girl into coming off with him so he can have sex with her and then just walk away at some point because he's not going to marry her because she has no money.
Yeah, and I think the thing that gets me thinking about it is the fact that they do run away rather than say what happens in Northanger Abbey, where it's implied that it all takes place in Bath, this tryst between Captain Tilney and Isabella. They don't run away, they don't leave the city. So there's actually nothing pinning them to each other. It's it's happened. You could deny it happened. If you leave the city together, then it definitely happened. It's, at the end of the day, he's showing his hand of being incredibly stupid and self-centered. But yeah, this bit, every time I come back to it, I'm like,
every Austen novel. I mean,
yeah,
Willoughby did it, and Willoughby gets a young girl pregnant and then leaves her.
And the thing about Willoughby is he I know this is not me defending his actions. Willoughby at least is smart enough to pick someone he knows has no.
Yeah.
He picks someone who is herself the product of a shameful union, so to speak.
He doesn't
And
do it
even
to Mary.
though, and even though he knows that Colonel Brandon is her, is her protector, there's nothing he can do, because in this society, she's worth less than nothing because she has no social standing. And you get that kind of repeatedly, that these people who exist at the very bottom of society get taken advantage of. It's a bit different in Mansfield Park, because you have two people of decent status and class who could have otherwise got married, doing the wrong thing. This one, it's like, I think what I go back and forth on is, what is she trying to display? Is it just stupidity? Is it arrogance? Is there something more sinister about the girls that he picks? Because you assume he only picks Georgiana because she's rich, and she knows him and he has an in. Yeah, Lydia. Or is it just that he's actually not as smooth and as cool as he thinks he is, and he gets seduced by Lydia Bennet, the most, unsubtle, tactless girl in society? It's a very interesting one, and I go back and forth on what I think she's exposing him for, or if it's all of the above.
I think it's a great shock moment too for first readers of this novel. I mean, it really comes out of nowhere, and then once it's talked about, and then you realize, well, this is exactly what they thought was going to happen, what Elizabeth thought could happen with Lydia. I mean, as the worst case scenario, and it's just nobody had thought to put Wickham with it, because they don't think Wickham is going to they don't think he's going to be that bad.
No, and I don't think they think he's that stupid either. Lizzie and Jane think he's cunning. And when you unpick it, you're like, well, is he cunning, or did he just go for the one rich girl he had a connection to? Like, how does he lose Mary King? We don't actually know, like, where these, it makes me wonder if actually part of the pride is that not only Lizzie and the other Bennets, but us as the reader, we assume that Wickham is really suave and he's like really manipulative and clever. He might actually just be an idiot. Like,
getting lucky.
It's entirely possible to read this novel, and I don't know, maybe this is being influenced by watching Glass Onion, but when I was rereading this, like, I was like, have I been conned? Is this man stupid? Like, is he really dumb? Like, why would you do this? It doesn't make any sense. I do wonder, but it also does show how shocking it is, because not only does the Bennets assume they've gone to Gretna, the other soldiers assume at first that they've gone to Gretna, and that realization.
He's been talking about it with the other. He's been telling Denny, I'm going to run off with her, and bragging about it.
Yeah, that kind of assumption that, like, the worst thing someone could possibly do is elope to Gretna, and then it's like, oh no, the worst thing you could possibly do is ruin them, which I think again just shows that they're not as worldly as they think they are. It's that kind of like unpleasant realization.
Well, Gretna Green is, and for those who don't know, that Gretna Green is it's just over the border in Scotland, where
it's the closest town essentially over the border.
So you don't need you don't have to obey British law in how you get married,
you can get married at 16 without parental consent, and that is, I think, still the case.
It's the Vegas. It's the Vegas. Of this world, that you go there for a quickie marriage. It's the place that all the parents hate, that all the teenagers think this is the most romantic thing in the world.
And there's lots of novels kind of pre-Pride and Prejudice, maybe 1760s, 1770s, of, scandalous rakes kidnapping pious young women, and they're racing to Gretna Green, and the hero is racing to try and stop them from forcing her into a marriage, and it's all very exciting. But
is there ever like this situation where it's like a good thing though, or is it always she's being tricked into going to Gretna Green to marry him? Is that all?
It's usually either she's been tricked or she's fully consenting and he turns out to continue to be a rake. So usually either a tenant or wildfowl horse situation, which I know is later than this, but just as an example of a young girl who marries a rake despite the advice of all of her friends.
Despite him telling her he's a rake. Too.
Yeah, like he's literally like, I'm a terrible person.
Barely hides.
I love you. Or it's someone like kidnapping someone who they want to marry without their parents' permission. You also didn't have to read wedding banns, which was the other thing. So for those of you that maybe aren't aware, you had to have the wedding banns read. So I think it was 6 weeks before you got married. So it had to be, or potentially 4, but every Sunday, whatever denomination, the priest had to say, these people are getting married on this date, let me know if there's an issue. Which is also why it's a wedding breakfast, because they made you get married first thing in the morning in the hopes that the groom would not be drunk. And that's why you have a wedding breakfast.
Yeah. I raise all this too, because, there are so many ways that this novel challenges the, kind of the I guess the kind of like the victimhood of Lydia and how Lydia sees it.
Mm-hmm.
I love the way I think perhaps audiences of Austen's time would view this differently than the way it will by the end of the novel. So it's things that we can't go into yet, but this is the beginning of this process of we'll see a little more in the next chapter with the letter from Lydia first.
Yeah. And it is, I know we talked about this last time I was on about Lydia. I think I went through a period of seeing this as Lydia having misguided agency. Yeah. Now I'm with a bit more perspective. I'm like, no, she's still a young woman. She's still underage. And I think even though people were getting married at 16, Austen also is like, Lydia is a child. This is not, he's taking advantage of a child. Yes. And that's incredibly problematic. And a crime. But that Lydia, misguided, naive, too young, we have this whole thing of, can you consent if you are not able or old enough to consent, X, Y, and Z. But there is an aspect to this where Lydia is the agent here. Like, Lydia has had an active role in making this happen and getting what she wants. And that is a very nuanced conversation, because you don't want to tread that dark path that sometimes happens in those descriptions.
I think we wind up disagreeing with the way she thinks life should be and the way she thinks relationships should be, and then the way we think relationships.
Yes.
So
yeah, like, she is a classic 15, 16-year-old. I think I said this last time. I remember thinking like Lydia and being like, I'm so grown up and I know everything about the world. And there is some level of argument here about female agency. It's one that has to be taken very sensitively.
Not argument at all. It's just that becomes a byproduct of this novel over time.
Of Lydia, yeah, definitely. And I think it's one that evolves. I know I always say this, but that's just one of the things I love so much about this text is every decade that goes by, we have a new perspective that we look at this text with. I think Lydia is one of those characters that we have a continually shifting idea of her.
We've got lots more Lydia to talk about for chapters here, but for now, she's read these letters. Oh my gosh, Mr. Darcy walks into the room.
Literally worst nightmare.
Yes, her pale face, and just as the time when he went to propose to her, where she's reading letters from Jane, thinking about how he broke them up. And he walks into the room. This time she's reading these letters of Lydia running away with Wickham, and he walks into the room. He sees her pale face and impetuous manner, makes him start. Good God, what's the matter? Cried he. And I think he sends out for some alcohol in a second, glass of wine.
You are very ill.
Get a glass of wine, not the brandy. So I think we're a little further away from the brandy. In the 19th century. She bursts into tears. He's it says in wretched suspense. He observes her in a compassionate silence, but this goes on for, minutes, where he's just in the room with her crying and not being able to tell. And, she's thinking, well, she tells him what happens finally, and then, she says to Darcy, him too well, Wickham, to doubt the rest. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him. She is lost forever. A much different reaction from Jane than we got from Elizabeth than we got from Jane. Jane's like, well, maybe
it'll be fine.
And Elizabeth's like, no, she's ruined immediately.
What's really beautiful about this moment is that, Lizzie's blaming herself a lot here. There's a lot of, we'll get this soon, but there's a lot of guilt clear at this moment, that because she has not exposed Wickham, or because she hasn't cautioned at least her nearest and dearest, that somehow she's responsible for this. But the fact that he's the one that told her this, because there is this element of this could have happened without him ever telling her about Wickham.
Oh, yeah.
And she would be just as shocked.
Yeah.
She's able to tell him. And she's also able to share this with someone she knows will share her sentiments.
Interesting.
Jane, as close as they are, as adoring of each other as they are, and as much as they can share these things, Lizzie doesn't have someone who understands her perspective. She did have that to an extent with Charlotte. That dynamic has changed through the marriage to Mr. Collins. She's starting to become more cognizant of her father's failings. And in this moment, ostensibly the worst thing that's ever happened to her is she tells him straight away.
Yeah.
And she's able to tell him because he's already been honest with her and he knows that information
about Wickham. This is
so it is this setup, but the fact that she is able to just be like, oh my God, this has happened. It's Wickham. And his response, obviously, he's in astonishment, but then she continues. And when you get this next thing where she says, when I consider, she added in a yet more agitated voice, that I might have prevented it, I who knew what he was, had I but explained some part of it only. That's her insecurity immediate, and her fear and her guilt immediately coming out. She doesn't have to tell him any of that. She doesn't have to share that with him. The fact that I think when you consider how mindful Lizzie is of certain aspects of propriety, she's not a slave to it, she's not ridiculous with it, but she is conscious of it and what's appropriate. But that she, through this experience at Pemberley, has come to trust him and has this connection with him, that's such a raw, emotional, vulnerable thing to express to another person. My sister is ruined and I might be semi-responsible for it because I could have protected her, and no matter how silly she is, I'm her big sister and I've kept this knowledge secret. And she tells him that, and I think it's a real standout moment. And he says, I'm grieved indeed, cried Darcy, grieved, shocked. But is it certain? Absolutely certain. He is not a person who repeats himself.
Yeah.
They have this super emotional, super vulnerable moment between them. And I think as a reader, as much as she is going to now think it's all ruined and over, as rightly should, I think as the reader, you have this sudden realization that these are two people who have come to develop a very strong, emotional, vulnerable bond. And I always say, oh, it's not romance, it's not romantic, this is a social satire. This moment of her being able to emotionally lean on him and share this burden with someone that's actually going to understand and see it the same way she sees it, I think it's really beautiful. And obviously Lizzie doesn't recognize it, as I don't think you would in the moment, but as the reader you have this amazing insight into what is developing between these two people.
And we also, it's all her perspective. We get when she says, I might have prevented it, all I'm thinking of, he must be thinking, well, no, you couldn't have. I didn't say you could, like you couldn't have revealed what he had done with my sister, but we don't get anything. We only get what he says, and how she sees him saying it, and what she sees him doing in the room at the time. And so Austen as the author pulls back and only gives us her view of this situation, which will then helps create this suspense that we don't really know what's going on with him, but then we only get her impression. And when he's kind of just pacing around the room and he's silent, and Elizabeth reads this as a kind of sign of disapproval, and she realizes that, she's, lost him. Which
I love this line as well, when she says her power was sinking.
Yeah.
Everything must sink under such a proof of family weakness, such an assurance of the deepest disgrace. But that description of it as her power was sinking, because that's what reputation is in this society. It's your capital, it's your sway, and they may not have much wealth, they may not have much status, but Lizzie trades on her reputation, her wit, her everything, and it's that acknowledgement that no matter how clever she is, no matter how charming she is, this is good, this is sinking. It's tearing all of her agency and all of her ability to be her own person away from her. I find that line really powerful, because that is heartbreaking to think in that moment.
And read that last sentence too. It was on the contrary.
Let me just flip it was, on the contrary, exactly calculated to make her understand her own wishes, and never had she so honestly felt that she could have loved him as now, when all love must be vain.
She
it's so sad.
This is, finally this is gonna work, and I didn't even think I would ever want it to work, and now, oh my gosh, it's gonna work, these last couple chapters. And that's
it's so genuine. I think, I know last time I was berating the Darcy merch with the first proposal, and but this is a very timeless, beautiful love story, but not because of those moments, because of these moments where the heartbreak of realizing that you could love and probably do love someone, and at the moment that you realize this wonderful spectrum of potentiality, it's all seemingly just completely shut down and ripped away. And you have that moment when you're like, oh, I could have done this so differently. If I'd have accepted the first proposal, if I'd have warned my family, none of this would be happening. And it's just so devastating in that moment.
His first proposal, Wickham would have taken her right to Gretna Green to marry him. That would have changed everything. Like, that would have been getting back at Darcy and becoming part of this family that Darcy would have to acknowledge. So but that's not the way it went. She, and then Darcy, quickly kind of spoke likewise restraint, and he kind of has to still be, I still have to be, the person that I am, and I can't kind of go to pieces. And he's like, oh, well, I guess, you can't see us. You can't come to Pemberley to see my sister. I'm very sorry. I'm really grieved. I mean, he means what he says, but it's, that, that would to heaven that anything could be either said or done on my part that might offer consolation to such distress. I think Darcy thinks this is really what I believe, and like I really am trying to be sympathetic, but I don't think Elizabeth can see any of that at this point. It's just
not at all. And
he's writing me off. He's walking out.
I think when he says, I will not torment you with vain wishes, which may seem purposefully to ask for your thanks. He's been in this situation. And I think he's thinking of her in a way that actually is very genuine and actually is very deep. But these aren't two people who have learned to communicate with one another. They're learning. And actually what he says with reflection, and you kind of have this impression that with time, this would be a moment that she would be able to reflect on and go, oh my God, actually in that moment, he wasn't pandering, he wasn't just saying what was meant to be said. He was genuinely thinking of me and my emotional state and, you know, what he would have needed in that moment. But to her, in her distress, in her moment, and of course he does know because he's been through a similar situation with his sister, but he still can't fully understand what it will be like for her and how different it is a situation for the Bennets as it would have been for the Darcys. And I think it's that thing of like, he sees her more as an equal now, or maybe he's still not fully able. It's still two people who are really unpacking and unlearning. And of course, you've got to build the tension. Austen's so good at this. In a few short sentences, that this budding relationship has fallen apart in a way, and there's lots of unspoken emotions from Darcy on this page. And that it just leaves on that tension. He literally exits in this moment of uncertainty, and it's very, very heightened. You feel very confused. I think the first time I read this, I was like, oh my god, no. Because you see it from Lizzie's perspective.
Well, and she immediately thinks she felt how improbable it was they should ever see each other again. He leaves. He's in the room, and then, you know, they're like, this is but then she does it, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this today. This is more important, this part, than even the whole next chapter is, I think. Is she does this when she's done this before. She does this whole retrospective of how she feels. Yeah, and for the reader, retrospective glance over the whole of their acquaintance, and it's this next paragraph that it's this: if gratitude and esteem are good foundations of affection paragraph. In my edition here, and this is a note from long ago, I have a line next to that and a question mark and confusing. Like, I couldn't like, what the heck is she talking about? It's a little complicated. It's almost like this. It's Austen with this kind of Johnsonian prose. I mentioned to Clyde, like, this is her in this kind of 18th century neoclassical style here writing. Yeah. And
it's very Fanny Burney as well. Like, it's this kind of like breaking the fourth wall.
Yeah. And I have to unpack it. And right before she says that, she recognizes the irony, you know, that she sighed at the perverseness of those feelings, which would now have promoted its continuance. Like I wish he could have continued loving me, but she would formerly have rejoiced in his term. Like, she was like, oh my God, I'm so happy he's not going to ask me again. And now she's like, oh no, he's not going to ask me
She's
again.
so happy to be away from him when they leave Rosings. And now she could not be further from that sentiment.
But here's how I unpack this now. If gratitude and esteem are good foundations of affection, then Elizabeth's change of sentiment will be neither improbable nor faulty. And it's that gratitude and esteem that is developed for Darcy over time that has led her to begin to love him. And then
it kind of brings the novel into this weird temporal space where this isn't a Jane Eyre story where we're being told the novel retrospectively. Austen plays with time in all of her texts. We are sometimes floating next to the character, sometimes slightly ahead of them, and she sort of switches sometimes between this. You get this in Northanger Abbey too. We start out with no one could have ever imagined Catherine to be X, Y, and Z, but then we catch up to her and we very much move alongside her. And obviously, I mentioned Northanger Abbey because famously Austen switches into that very definite authorial voice when she defends the novel. This little bit here where she switches to this in the moment free and direct discourse where she's saying will be neither, it's pinpointing the moment. that it comes to realization. We as the reader, Austen as the writer, we all know that this has been steadily growing. We can see it. We know it's been there. We know it's been there ever since the first time they danced together. But we know it's solidified while she's been at Pemberley. It's marking this moment. She has the realization 2-3 paragraphs above. Now we are acknowledging that this change of sentiment, and it's saying to the reader directly, well, this is neither improbable nor faulty, because these are, here's the reasons. And I think we've talked about this before, that, this is a novel told through Elizabeth's perspective. But that doesn't mean that the events that are happening, if we think about it in a metatextual way, if we think about this as something that's real and really happening, just because we're looking through Elizabeth's eyes for most of the time doesn't mean that Elizabeth's is the only perspective. And it's that moment of turning towards the audience and kind of going, I know you might think that this is sudden and she's only realized this because she's lost the opportunity, but let's be real, it's deeper than that, and we all know it's deeper than that. And I think it brings that element of Austen through, where these novels are all about reality. They're not necessarily realism in the way that some of the 18th century authors were, sometimes to their detriment, because they were incredibly boring. But what she is always doing is trying to represent internal emotion, internal psyche to the truest, most believable aspect. And I think it's that like little kind of moment of, may I remind you that this is a person with interiority, and you too have interiority, and we are not a narrative. We participate in narratives, but our individual beings are not narratives. And I think when we remember when this is happening, and obviously we don't know if that line was in First Impressions, we don't know if it comes, when she's redrafting in 1812, we don't know when that comes into it. But I think when I'm thinking about this text very much in terms of a Napoleonic context, in terms of a early romantic context, what a wonderful little interjection, this tiny little fourth wall break, to just remind us of how these connections develop, and how human beings internalize their feelings and how we think about ourselves. Because then she unpacks.
Yeah.
We have this moment of, I'm talking to you, reader. And now with this in mind, here's Lizzie unpacking everything that's happened and how we've gotten to this point. Yeah. And I think it just shows how invested Austen was in her context, her cultural context, and her philosophical context to an extent. Yeah. But for a modern reader, for a contemporary reader approaching this, she's still doing, the author is doing it in a very kind of, 18th century neoclassical way. And it's how I translate this paragraph is that kind of, as I said, that the gratitude and esteem, that's the whole part of her falling in love with him, that developed over time, is she thinks that, well, maybe the other way of falling in love, that kind of love at first sight way, is better. But she recognizes that she already did that with Wickham in a sense, and it didn't work. She looked at Wickham and it's like, yeah, you're really hot, but you know what? I didn't really feel anything for you. I just like the attention. And this is why the long route with Darcy is important. The less interesting one, she calls it, in falling for someone. It's less interesting because it's not that romantic, daring, following your lust. It's not the Lydia way, and it's better. And it's also it's such a fundamental part of Lizzie's journey of acknowledging her own pride, because what she says in not so many words, as we switch from the direct authorial voice to the indirect, is that Lizzie never really noticed anything, or would have noticed anything if it was there, because she was so convinced of Wickham's attraction to her that she wouldn't have necessarily seen it. And because she, as we've kind of noticed before, does see herself as being superior to Lydia, it just would not have been it wouldn't have been something that she considered. And because she saw him as an equal, it's that thing of like, she basically says, doesn't she, you know, it had appeared incomprehensible, but now it was all too natural. For such an attachment as this, she might have sufficient charms, and though she did not suppose Lydia to be deliberately engaging in an elopement without the intention of marriage, she had no difficulty in believing that neither her virtue nor her understanding would preserve her. So it's that kind of moment of, not only have I dismissed the complexity of my sister's character, I've also judged Wickham through my own lens and how I think about myself, and I've like, you know, projected my own pride onto him because I fancied him. And because I fancied him, part of the reason I fancied him is because I saw myself in him, and I saw this kindred spirit. And, you know, what we've come to realize, and she's coming to realize, is that actually her and Darcy have probably a lot more in common. But yeah, that kind of, that flip that she's experiencing and that realization. And she says, you know, later, Lydia had wanted only encouragement to attach herself to anybody. That, you know, Lydia still mentioned plenty of times how attractive Wickham is. It's not like just because he seemed interested in Lizzie, she just completely discounted him. We've seen all through the earlier chapters that both Kitty and Lydia were plenty interested in Mr. Wickham. He just wasn't that interested in them.
And Elizabeth is, you know, realizing all this about herself and how she feels, but it's all, you know, the regret that what could have been with Darcy. And then it's because of Lydia, now she knows that Wickham not only has no intention because there's no money to begin with sex, but, you know, it's that this is, Elizabeth recognizes the ramifications and how it kind of spreads, goes out for everybody.
And it kind of, you know, it mimics that earlier, his whole "my good opinion once lost." Like, I just imagine that is what is ringing through her head. Like, if I was to adapt this, like, for stage, I would just have that booming, like, repeatedly, and her just kind of,
how's your good opinion of me now?
Like, that would be me. I would just be hearing him say that, and me remembering me going and then thinking, oh my god,
we'll flashback to that line.
Because I think that's what she's thinking of, and I think that's what we're all thinking of, that moment, because it's such a famous line, but for a reason.
Well, the gardeners come in, and so Lydia had never been a favorite with them. Mr. and Mrs. Gardner could not help but be deeply affected. Not Lydia only, but all were concerned in it. They also realized the deeper ramifications, that Lydia's making a selfish choice here, and that's going to affect everyone. And Lydia's just not, I don't know, she's just not smart enough to realize it. I mean, it's, you know, it's, I don't know if it's selfishness or the fact that no one's educated her to realize.
It's a bit of both. And I think, and not to spoil, I think when Lydia reappears later, you get the impression that she somehow thought that, you kind of get the impression that she thinks she's got a plan. And I think Lydia is,
I don't want to go on that road.
But she's naive enough, I think, to think that she could seduce him.
We'll get a little bit in this chapter. We're going to hit a letter from her, and then we can talk about that there. They her uncle in the next chapter here, chapter 47, her uncle says, well, he's not going to just, do, like, he thinks, like, he can't be that stupid. He's not just going to take her and
I love this bit about the regiment. He's like, could he expect to be noticed again by the regiment after such an affront to Colonel Forster?
The regiment he was bragging about that he was doing this with. And the regiment is going to have to leave because he's got too many debts in every single place that he goes to. Like, this is
real soldiers.
It's an exit strategy. It's an exit strategy for Wickham. He's not concerned with anything going on there. I've got to get the heck out of here. I owe too much money in Meryton, and we'll find out that he's, he's not going
to be.
He can't.
He's not going to be court-martialed.
No,
Like,
but he also can't continue as an, like, I can't stay in here because I'm,
yeah.
I've done too many things wrong.
Yeah, that bit really makes me laugh, just because
Yeah.
in any other regiment, in a real regiment, then yeah, probably you would be your colonel would probably hunt you down, arrest you, you'd be court-martialed, like lots of terrible things would probably happen to you. In a militia regiment run by a man who also married a teenager, nah.
Yeah.
You're gonna get away with it.
Yeah. And for Lydia, Elizabeth's like, Wickham will never marry a woman without some money. He cannot afford it. What claims has Lydia? What attraction has she beyond youth, health, and good humor that could make him, for her sake, forego every chance of benefiting himself by marrying well? She has no brothers to step forward. And you might imagine from my father's behavior, from his indolence and the little attention he has ever seemed to give what was going forward in his family, that he would do as little and think as little about it. This is the answer to Wickham, like thinking maybe he would just do, like, he realizes this family's not going to do anything about this. I'm just going to go, take this girl away, have sex with her, leave her. And what are they going to do? I'm already just going to go off and do something else anyway. He's left his regiment. He's abandoned that, and he's given that up.
That's the only thing that makes me, again, like, I'm always like, why does he take it? Like, obviously he takes to London because it's easy to be lost in London, but I would never do this. If it was me, I would just abandon it straight away. It just more and more makes me think that it's a doubling down on Wickham is actually an idiot. Because even though he's smart enough to maybe know that they probably can't do anything about it, he could have still had his cake and eaten it. It's just, yeah. He's not
done
smart,
with being
man.
a soldier in this militia. He's done with it. I'm going to go and do something else. And you know what? I'm going to take this girl with me, and that's all I'm going to do. And then for Lydia, Elizabeth thinking, or does she say, no, she is for 12 months, she has been given up to nothing but amusement and vanity. She has been allowed to dispose of her time in the most idle and frivolous manner, and to adopt any opinions that came in her way. Since the Shire were first, quartered in Meryton. Since, this is, of course, she's not going to think there's any consequences to this, because this is the way, literally, she has been raised by her mother to think that this is okay.
And I think it reminds you how sheltered they are, because that why would they think anything bad would happen?
Yeah.
Like, why would they? Like,
do
they know these things happen?
It seems only the first two. It seems that just Jane and Elizabeth have any kind of idea about the rest of the world. And we had one line earlier in the novel about how the Aunt Gardner had, I think it even said, frequently taken them. Like, they have had experience in the world, but then after Elizabeth with Mary, who probably wasn't interested in doing anything, and the final two, they haven't had any experience except Meryton.
Yes.
They go from their house to Meryton, and that's it.
And it implies as well that if Jane and Lizzie have often been with the Gardners or with the Phillips, we know that they go to both families, because the Phillips children are also very close and fond, it seems, of the two oldest Bennets. And we can assume, maybe considering how young the Phillips children are, the Gardner children, sorry.
The Gardner children.
Wrong family. The Gardner children are. That Jane and Lizzie were probably sent to their Aunt Gardner when she was having her lying in. So this is something that Jane and Cassandra used to do for their sister-in-laws, that when you were close to giving birth, your sister or a sister-in-law would come and take care of your children. Mrs. Bennet obviously is not going to do that. So you kind of get
Kitty
this
and Lydia
impression,
were too young. They never had the opportunity.
Yeah. So you get this impression, not only have the sisters been gone, that means that the few positive influences the younger girls might have had have also been gone. So not only, have they been totally indulged by Mrs. Bennet and neglected by their father, they've not had that positive influence of the two oldest sisters. Because you kind of get the impression that, if Jane had been responsible for them, they might have turned out differently.
All right, let's skim through this a little bit and get to Lydia's letter. Elizabeth arrives back home. Although I love the little gardeners, attracted by the sight of the chaise, were standing on the steps of the house as they
They're
entered.
so cute.
I know. And when the carriage drove up to the door, the joyful surprise that lighted up their faces and displayed itself over their whole bodies in a variety of capers and frisks was the first pleasing earnest of their welcome. I don't know if she's being ironic here or not, but like, oh my God, these kids are running around, jumping all over everything. But
well, I don't know, because
this.
Austen was also very fond of her nieces and nephews.
Yeah. And this moment of pleasure with the children here is, I really, this is like Shakespearean. This is like, in the midst of all this tragedy, suddenly a comic comes on, or like there's a little gem, her version of it, there's a little gem of joy in this chapter.
And it's that reminder that, like in Shakespeare, that life goes on, that there's other things happening. There's still, these young children are not going to be aware of the fact that their cousin has just ruined half the family. They're just so excited because their mum and dad are back, and they've brought cousin Lizzie with them. Like, how exciting. And
another sign of what good people the gardeners must be, that their children are just that happy to see them. So they're not raising these little bratty kids who are, it's a happy family, and it's nice to see. But of course, that's not interesting in a novel, Tolstoy, right? You want unhappy families. That's what we're the
generational trauma only.
Yes. Elizabeth and Jane are together again. Mrs. Bennet blames everyone but herself. Like, of course, I always said he was no good, and I don't want to. I mean, they're kind of funny lines, but it gets a little tiresome with Mrs. Bennet at this point in the novel. Like, of course, it's all your fault in a sense. Like, why did you encourage her? Why did you let her go? It's not her fault. I mean, it's she bears responsibility, but clearly, it's Wickham's fault that this has occurred. She thinks she can still have a respectable wedding. She's telling her brother, like, oh, make sure she goes and gets the wedding clothes at the right place. Like, she's not quite comprehending how disastrous this is. She's not comprehending that Wickham is literally tricked her daughter into going off with him under the pretense of marriage, but instead she's just going to stay with him, and they're going to have sex, and then he's going to leave her. Like, she can't get that in her, or that's just so far from her own experience, right? That she, kind of got the guy interested in her and married him.
It's hard, it's hard to tell, and I think this is kind of, we get the impression from Lydia's letter in a moment that this is what Lydia is also thinking, like that, Mrs. Bennet did it. And I think there's definitely two readings. There's the one of Mrs. Bennet is in denial. She is unable to acknowledge. She's unable to let herself think that way, because if that comes to pass, everything's over. And it's similar to how she tries to convince Lizzie that she should marry Mr. Collins, that kind of same level of delusion of like, well, as long as they're married and that's possible, everything will be fine. The other flip side of it is that, like the girls, she is so sheltered that she cannot imagine that could possibly happen, that there are people in the world that would do this type of thing to someone who is technically a gentleman's daughter and technically a member of the gentry. This is the type of thing that happens to poor, unfortunate girls with nothing to their names, like in Sense and Sensibility. But we know, obviously, that that's not true, particularly if you think about the reader of Pride and Prejudice. They just read Sense and Sensibility. Yeah. They know it nearly happens to Marianne. So, it's that question.
Mrs. Bennet's also vicariously reliving her life through her daughters. She's even talked about it earlier in the novel, like, oh, how much she loved a red coat.
Oh, and back in my day.
Like, I mean, she wishes she could have run off to Gretna Green or London, and then we'll just get married there anyway, with an officer. That she sees this still as the kind of, the romantic, elopement that Lydia believes it is as well. The gardeners are very concerned about the servants, and they need to isolate her. So the servants don't. I don't know where the line is here, but they're concerned that the servants are overhearing everything that is going on here, and of course it's impossible that everything that but that acknowledgement that once the servants find out, everybody knows this. And
it recalls that moment earlier when Lizzie is like, stop talking in front of the servants. I can't remember, I think it's when they're talking about going to Brighton, when they go to the inn place.
and they meet Lydia and Kitty on the road, and they send the servant out.
Yeah, and I think there is another moment as well with their mother earlier on where it's kind of like an eye roll of like, oh, she's blabbing in front of the servants again.
Yeah.
Now it's this isn't just gossip of like, oh, Mrs. Bennet said this about, Lady Lucas. This is, it's out now.
Yeah, they said, for they knew that she had not the prudence enough to hold her tongue before the servants while they waited at table, and judged it better that one only of the household, and the one whom they could most trust, it's King, right? Mrs. King.
Yeah.
And all her fears and solicitude on the subject. And people read the wonderful novel Longbourn by who wrote Longbourn? Joe, I can't remember the name. Joe Baker, that's it. Longbourn. Really great novel in the kind of Pride and Prejudice story told through the servant's point of view. But they can't really keep it from happening. Everybody's going to find out about this. Jane keeps seeing the best in people. She thinks Colonel Forster, oh, what a nice guy he was. He came to us right away and helped us. And Denny and
he's so useless. Useless.
We find out that Kitty did know of it beforehand. And we had a hint of that that I remarked on the letters that Lydia had sent, and there were underlined passages that Kitty was not reading aloud to the family. And then we find out that she had told Lydia before. And then we get a letter from Lydia to
Mrs. Forster.
It was to Mrs. Forster, Harriet. Here you go. You want to read that, and this is hilarious.
Okay. My dear Harriet, you will laugh when you know where I am gone, and I cannot help laughing myself at your surprise tomorrow morning as soon as I am missed. I am going to Gretna Green, and if you cannot guess with who, I shall think you a simpleton. For as there is but one man in the world I love, and he is an angel.
Let me stop there because she means that. But she means as flighty and something. She means that right there.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and because she's 16, and when you fall in love at 16, you think that it is the most eternal, truest thing ever. And I think also that she is confident enough, and the bad thing, because of the way she's been indulged, I don't think it's an inherently bad thing. She's so sure of herself and of her charms that she's like, yeah, of course he would want to go to Gretna Green and marry me despite the fact I have no money, because that's what people in love do. Like, of course this makes complete and perfect sense. This isn't, I am fully agent in this.
Read the rest of that. I'm sorry, I had to interrupt that.
Okay. I should never be happy without him, so think it no harm to be off. You need not send them word at Longbourn of my going if you do not like it, for it will make the surprise the greater when I write to them and sign my name, Lydia Wickham. What a good joke it will be. I can hardly write for laughing.
And there's the irony there. The irony that the reader and the other characters realize that, like, no, you're being tricked. Like this, the seriousness of it that Lydia doesn't catch, that that we can acknowledge her, her kind of agency, and that she is doing the thing that she wants to do, but she's also being tricked by somebody, and that she can't see.
And it reveals again, like we were saying, about Lydia's understanding of the scope of society, and that actually she has, because she's come in too young, she's too sheltered, her understanding is very surface level. She's like, oh, this is going to be hysterical. I'm going to write to my sisters and call myself Lydia Wickham, because she's only thinking in the moment. She's got no concept of what it's like to be a married woman and what that means, particularly he is a soldier. He's not a real one, but he can be sent anywhere in the country. That she's then like, oh, tell Pratt I'm sorry I can't dance with him, and don't worry about me, I'll send for my clothes, because this is the sphere that she understands. This is the sum total of her experience and her understanding. Her biggest concern is, oh, this person's going to be disappointed that I've not kept my engagement with them.
Mm-hmm.
And her next biggest concern is about her clothes. I wish you would tell Sally to mend a great slit in my worked muslin gown before they are packed up. Make sure you tell the maid to mend my gown before you send it. But that's other than that. Have a good drink.
Yeah, Elizabeth's response is, oh, thoughtless Lydia. Like it's just she can't understand the ramifications, the consequences of what she is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Bennett, Jane says, she says, I never saw anyone so shocked. He could not speak a word for full 10 minutes. Oh, how about that? Mr. Bennett didn't have some kind of sarcastic remark.
Had nothing to
some
say.
Funny, cynical thing to say, like, oh, well, how about that? No, because this is the beginning of Mr. Bennett realizing, this is my fault.
If this was happening in the age of TikTok, this would be a TikTok meme, and it would just be him silent with well. if not the consequences of my actions. Yeah. And then they Lizzie and Jane reinforce when she says, was there a servant belonging to it who did not know the whole story before the end of the day?
Yeah.
And Jane's like, well, I hope so, but probably not.
No. And we know that because then Phillips comes to Longbourn, and then Lady Lucas comes to Longbourn to commiserate. Lady Lucas Jane says, Lady Lucas has been very kind. She walked here on Wednesday morning to condole with us and offered her services, or any of her daughters, if they could be of use to us. Elizabeth recognizes what's going on here. Lady Lucas is like, your daughter's ruined, huh? So my daughter married Mr. Collins.
I'm here on charity and
is very respectable right now. Elizabeth has this really rough of a cynical line. Assistance is impossible from one's neighbors. Assistance is impossible. Condolence insufferable. Let them triumph over us at a distance and be satisfied. Elizabeth,
which kind of on the flip side of the coin echoes what Darcy said genuinely about not being able to come for her. He says, like, anything I could say to you is meaningless, and it would seem like I'm just wanting to be thanked. And that's kind of what they're doing. They're just turning, it's the 18th century equivalent of turning up with a lasagna to put in the oven. Oh my God, I'm so sorry this terrible thing's happened to you. Let me come and look at your distress, and then go home and tell everybody about it, but also feel good about myself because I've been a good neighbor and I've gone and consoled. And again, it's that kind of parallel between the two of them, that they have a very similar perspective, but also she's such a savage, and it's brilliant.
So alrighty, well, that's where we'll leave it. Jay Knights, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. And thanks to all of you who have donated or joined as members over the last week. Your support helps us bring this show to everyone, create other one-of-a-kind programs and courses, and also helps us care for our collections at the Rosenbach. Thanks to all who have donated. but many who have also joined as the Rosenbach as members. Rosenbach membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to members-only events. And 2 new members in the last week, Emily G. from Philadelphia, PA, and Beth H. from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, have joined. And I thank you both very much. It really is true that this show wouldn't exist without your support. Everybody sign up for Pickwick Monthly. It's going to be a blast. Pickwick Papers is a funny novel with a great blast of a cast of characters who do funny things all throughout 20 months. It will be. There was a question from Karen who asked if are there different versions of Pickwick Papers? How can viewers be sure we are reading the version that is being discussed? Yeah, Dickens pretty much wrote his novels as a serial and then just published what he wrote. Very little editing after that. So yeah, any version of Pickwick Papers will be fine. It'll just be the chapters that you'll need to read every month. Remember, everybody, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where you can look us up and continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook for that. And as you are watching the video right now on YouTube, I ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave comments there as well. That would be really good. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat Mrs. Reynolds, for managing the links today. Thanks to Clara Tuite for taking a turn about the room with us today. Join us on our next episode when President of the Jane Austen Society of Australia, Susanna Fullerton, will be here to take a turn about the room with me, and Dr. Kathleen Hudson will return as annotation co-host for chapters 48 to 50, which I'm calling Lydia and the Wickedest Young Man in the World. Just a quote from the book. So,
I like it.
all righty. Thank you, Lauren. This is always a blast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good. I'm glad you got to do these chapters with me.
Yeah, I like these ones. And if you're not sick of me, you can find me at the Ghoul Guides on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Anchor. We just released episode 10 of the Ghoul Guide Association, all about the Gothic genesis of true crime.
Of true crime, yes, I saw that. I can't wait to. I mean, I didn't watch it yet, but I saw that you had done that, and I can't wait to watch it. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening and closing credits music. Thanks to my daughter, Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. May your heart always reach your own Gretna Green. Bye-bye.